right, we left off on this question. What makes authority legitimate and therefore creates political obligation? Now, if you just think this is me making this up, all right, we left you on the last video with the first video of this unit. What makes authority legitimate and therefore creates political obligation? I hope you don't think that I'm just making this up. It is an interesting question, but I'm not the first to consider it. In his Social Contract, Rousseau, another famous political philosopher, he said this: suppose the government commands that in the interest of the state, meaning the government, that you should die, and pronounces a sentence of death upon you. What makes this pronouncement legitimate, or can anything make it legitimate? That's an interesting question. Can anything make it legitimate? The very fact that you no longer exist, and the government is requiring that you do this, he asks that question, can anything make it legitimate? Going back to the definition, the legitimate force to control human behavior. So Rousseau asked this important question, can anything make that legitimate? And his answer was, yes, it could. And I hope you thought a little bit about this. So, and you've come up with an answer of your own. But this was the answer: consent. The reason it is legitimate for the government to require that you serve in the military and potentially die for your country is because you have consented. You have consented to live under the rule of this government. You have taken advantage of the protections the government has offered. And as part of that, you owe them a duty. And that duty may even include the loss of your life in defense of your country. Now, if you think this is all just well and good and this is all theory, let's go to the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson writing, he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." We're all familiar with this. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's interesting, in his time, people talked about life, liberty, and property, going back to the original purpose of government, protection of property. But Thomas Jefferson slipped in this pursuit of happiness. What does that mean? Well, people today take it to mean whatever they want it to mean, but the reality is there's no legal force to that. But I'm getting you straight. We'll come back to that later in the course, I'm sure. So, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So in order to do all this, we institute governments, and they get their powers, their just powers, from the consent of the government. We consent, and therefore that makes the government legitimate, is the argument. It's a pretty good argument. If we don't like the government, what can we do? We can leave. We could just leave the country if we don't like it. Some kids say, you know what? I don't like the government of my parents' household, and so they run away. They're refusing to consent to their parents' domain. Why can't we do that with the government? So the question becomes, does the United States allow for consent? How do we allow for consent? Do we actually consent? And we'll get into that in here in a little bit. Now, what type of government is best suited to affect the purposes of government? So we're kind of shifting gears here. So what type of government is best suited to affect the purposes of government? Now, remember what the purposes of government are. Whoops. Where'd we go? Here we go. Here are the purposes of government. Maintain order, meaning protecting life and protecting property, and providing public goods, roads, and then this contemporary purpose of equality. So the question now becomes, what type of government is best suited to affect the purposes of government? What type of government will do that? All right, so we want to look at a number of different types of government and see if they are able to affect the purposes for which government was created. Here are some examples of democracy. Now, if we go back, obviously in the United States, our bias is going to be one towards democracy. I don't want to hold you to that bias. The question becomes though, if we were correct in our view that a legitimate government requires consent, can a dictatorship really do that? You don't have the opportunity to consent in a dictatorship. You don't have the opportunity to leave on your own. The dictator enforces his or her will. That's just how it is. So what we want to do, but you can certainly challenge these ideas if you want. So in a democratic centralist government. Now notice this may be in name only. So government is democratic if its decisions will serve the true interest of the people, whether or not the people directly affect the decision making. So this doesn't sound particularly democratic at all. When you look at the definition of democratic centralism, you'll understand a little more when I give you an example as to what country practices this form of democracy. The country which considered itself a democratic centralist country was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So here we know them as a communist country, but yet they considered themselves a democracy under this theory of democratic centralism, because their decisions would serve the true interest of the people. We find this foreign because we don't perceive it as, because people did not directly or even indirectly affect the decisions, the making of the decisions. You think about this, though, you can look at another form of government in which you could classify it as a democratic centralist government, and that is the family. How many times did your parents say to you when you're growing up, as long as you live under my roof, you will follow my rules? I'm making these decisions for you which are in your best interest. I heard that as a kid, and shockingly enough, I said it as a parent. So there's something to this idea. The problem is when you don't have that familiar relationship that is hopefully bound by love, and you've got this on a vast scale in a country. How is absence love? How is it that government can make decisions for people where the people themselves don't directly affect the making of those decisions? And so we in the United States see this as illegitimate because it does not allow for consent. So we reject this form of democracy, and we of course would not even classify it as democracy. We reject this form of democracy as being illegitimate because it does not allow for consent. All right. Sorry, you can't see that very well. Let me see if I can move that real quick. There we go. So another form of democracy that hopefully will do away with the issue of consent is participatory democracy or direct democracy. Aristotle, his definition of democracy was demo. What does that mean? Rule of the many. That was democracy, and it was possible in his day because in those days people were organized into city-states. Today we have nation-states, so we have these vast nations. But in those days, a city was what we would call a state. It was the entity. So Glendora would have been the state of Glendora. Pasadena would have been the state of Pasadena. So you would literally would have had thousands and thousands of these states. And so this idea of participatory democracy, where everybody directly affects the making of the decisions, was possible because the city-state was small. Now you take a country like the United States today. There are over 330 million people in the United States today. So first off, how do we even get all together to make decisions? That would be a monumental task, to say the least, if not impossible. Consider Dodger Stadium. Dodger Stadium holds about 50,000 people. There are all sorts of problems when you try to get 50,000 people together in a comparatively small area, the stands of Dodger Stadium. One of the issues is feeding them. Another issue is bathroom issues. One time when I was a kid, I had a paper route as a kid. I worked for the Progress Bulletin in those days. And we would get somebody to subscribe to the paper, and the newspaper would send us to a Dodger game. They'd give us a ticket, and they'd give us a bus ride on the bus. And me and my brothers, we each had a paper out. I had two brothers about my age, and we were going to Dodger Stadium all the time. We lived in Chino. Catch this bus ride and had a great time. Now, one time I go in there, Mother Nature calls while I'm there, and I've got to use the facilities. I go into the bathroom, and unbeknownst to me, this was the first time I went. Unbeknownst to me, in Dodger Stadium, the men's bathroom, and I've been told they're still there. In the middle of the bathroom, they have what can only be described as stainless steel pee troughs. They're about 10 feet long, about 15, 16 inches deep. Maybe 13 inches wide, and people stand on both sides just urinating into this stainless steel pee trough. And so anyway, I walk in there, and the pee trough had become clogged. Now remember what I said, it's about 15 inches deep. And urine was a half inch away from the top of this stainless steel pee trough. And people were just going in. They were just going into it. What else could they do? And this, I know, is a disgusting example, but it is a apropos example to the problem of getting all these people together in one place, trying to do anything, let alone trying to make policy. And so the problem with participatory or direct democracy, even though it allows for consent, is it's impractical in a modern nation state. To be able to get any amount of people that in some way approximates the nation as a whole. Just absolutely impossible. Now, some people have suggested, well, we could do this by the internet. Problem. What would people think if it was done by the internet? They would think that hackers hacked it, and that that basically you had a few hackers that were controlling what was going on in the United States, because they could manipulate what was theoretically or supposedly decided at these super large town hall, nation hall meetings, and it just wouldn't be seen as legitimate. So we've rejected democratic centralism because it is really not democratic. It does not allow for consent. And while we like participatory democracy because it allows for consent, it is just not practical in the modern nation state. So the next one we'll look at is the third, which is representative democracy. This time limit's up, so I'm going to pause this or stop this, and we'll go from there.